So Engender is an organisation for victim survivors of family violence. We exist for women, non-binary and transgender people. We work with men when they are victims of family and interpersonal violence. We also work with women, non-binary and transgender people when they've been referred to us as the primary aggressor. When men who use violence and abuse get in touch with us, we try to support them on to Relationships Australia or No to Violence. Consistent with the experience across Australia, the majority of our clients are women who experience violence and abuse from their current male partner or ex-partner. Now, the prevalence of family violence in Australia is partly a result of methodical and pervasive systems that is designed to silence the victim survivors and the issue as a whole. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this because this year, for me, has been dominated by the question of whether there has or has not been an increase in family violence over the COVID lockdown. And this question on its own contributed to the silencing of the experience of family violence. Universally, there are many silencing factors. Why people don't or can't immediately pick up and leave their abusive partner, or why might people stay in oppressive and stifling relationships, are all part of the why doesn't she leave question. Now, this is a valid question. We need to be questioning why people are not more readily able to leave abusive relationships. We need to do this so we might be able to make pathways out of terror-invoking relationships simpler and less arduous for victim survivors. There's no other crime in the world that is less easy to recognise, where the impact of the crime creates a sense of confusion about who is responsible and where the blame lies, and then entirely relies on the victim to collect the body of evidence and pursue the course of justice. But alongside the why doesn't she leave question is a set of values that both implies and evokes shame, blame, disdain, and ultimately an experience of social and personal reduction that further undermines her dignity. This is the culture that family violence victims experience. So when we ask, why doesn't she leave? We might be asking, how can we be improving our system response to make it easier to live without abuse? But usually what's actually being asked is, what's wrong with her? And along with that is a process of ostracising. It positions the victim survivor as unrelatable, unusual, and sometimes, and especially in the case of women with intersecting experiences, such as people with disabilities, they are considered to be deficient and passive. And as I was thinking about this, I thought of the expression mail order bride, which is a term that erases any agency, any will, any personality, any personal history from the scenario she's described in. A mail order bride is an object in a catalogue plucked off the shelf and shipped to Tasmania. This process of silencing the experience of family violence has some unique characteristics in Tasmania. Life in non-urban communities and social norms and values in rural communities further act to minimise the experience of family violence and deter women from seeking support. Traditional masculinity in rural communities may be more narrowly defined than in rural areas, valuing strength, courage and domination. There are Australian studies that show that male violence is more normalised in rural communities. Another feature of our rural and remote communities is the idea that individuals should be stoic and self-reliant and that family problems should be kept private. And it's not uncommon for Engender counsellors to hear about the challenges of leaving relationships when all of the assets are tied up in the farm, the children's lives are enmeshed with the farm, and where the woman seeking our support does the bookkeeping and administrative duties for the farming business. Now, under COVID, the condition for women in unequal relationships has worsened, with increased opportunities for abusive people to control and monitor their partners, less visibility, less opportunities to seek help, couples spending more time together, and increased stresses. We've witnessed a dramatic increase in the complexity and severity of family violence across the state, and I'll describe the particular conditions that contributed to this. And firstly, we need to understand that family violence typically refers to patterns of behaviour that over time direct the goals that are set, the way that people communicate, the lifestyle that's led, the family dynamic, where one person limits and dominates and controls their partner or ex-partner. Financial abuse, physical abuse, post-separation abuse are mechanisms for this to happen. So over COVID lockdown, we saw conditions change in such a way that enabled abuse and violence to increase in severity and prevalence. Now, starting with economic insecurity, increased shame-invoking experiences, poverty or scarcity-related stress led to psychological stress, poor mental health, increased alcohol use, all these things known to be reinforcing factors in family violence. And while these factors may influence people who use abusive behaviour to arc up and act with more vigour, economic insecurity also decreases people's independence. The relationship gets harder to leave. And next, the psychological impacts of lockdown and restriction, where lockdown is both the source of increased anxiety, alongside it being used as a mechanism to monitor, control, and further isolate your partner. This in turn is more difficult for people seeking help. Within this context, violence and abuse was often further hidden. Family, neighbours, friends, schools were no longer able to witness or be a sounding board to people in abusive relationships. We also saw the impacts of COVID on women post-separation. And one woman we support, Mary, worked as a nurse, and so her children kept attending school. Their father, Darren, was refusing to accept that the relationship was over, and when his workplace closed down as part of lockdown, he started driving back past their house at every opportunity. He would threaten not to return the children, saying that Mary was putting the children at risk by keeping them in school. And he used to try and get Mary to allow him to move back in the house so he could look after the kids while she was at work. So in this example, Darren's abuse escalated and Mary's fear escalated. She was actually very worried that he would make a report to Child Safety Services and that she'd be investigated and considered a bad parent, which is a common thing that we see. Another impact of the COVID lockdown period that we saw was the development of new normals. And an example of this is a client from the southeast of Tassie. I'll call her Rebecca. Rebecca's a woman with a disability, and during the time that Rebecca has engaged with Engender, she had set numerous goals for losing weight and looking after her health, and this is something that she's really regularly concerned about. Her partner, Stephen, however, actively seeks to sabotage her efforts to exercise and to eat healthily. He orders takeaway food and cooks deep-fried foods in their deep fryer at home. So at the beginning of COVID-19, when Rebecca would normally have been tending a course and having a small amount of autonomy that she'd actually really actively fought for, Rebecca told Stephen that she was going to lose weight, exercise and eat healthily. She set her goals. Rebecca said, though, told us that Stephen had mocked her and told her that she didn't know what she was talking about. He'd presented himself as the expert on her body and her weight loss. And following this, Stephen said he was struggling with his mental health and needed Rebecca to be available to him constantly. Rebecca said she'd stopped trying to get out of the house for any form of exercise or make herself healthier foods. She said that the fight just wasn't worth it. Now, during COVID, Rebecca assumed the role of homeschooling the children. Stephen used this to limit her time for exercising and doing other things. He told her that they needed to be child-focused and impressed upon her that the children were feeling anxious and needed to be available to them. During COVID, Rebecca continued to engage with her counsellor here through phone appointments that she would take from her car after telling Stephen she was leaving the house to go to the supermarket. So these appointments were very brief. They were check-ins, and Stephen was really closely monitoring her. So she was using the opportunity to go to the supermarket as a smokescreen for being able to access some support. Now, even after the social distancing restrictions have lifted, and Rebecca's been able to attend face-to-face appointments. She's shared that about the struggle that she's been experiencing for engaging back in regular life, the life she had before the lockdown. Stephen continues to have his mental health challenges and actively tries to sabotage Rebecca's goals for being healthy. She's identified that Stephen wants her to be home with him all the time to continue the new normal. What we've seen for this particular person is that real erosion in her self-esteem and self-worth, to the point where she seems less inclined now to find a way out of the relationship. So you can see from these examples of how COVID worsened condition for women, but also just how difficult help seeking is. And I want to go back to the silencing of family violence as an issue in itself, and for the experience of victim survivors. Because a far more serious consequence than anything else I've mentioned yet is the methodical and pervasive silencing of victim survivors that helps protect people who use abusive behaviours. Opportunities for perpetrator accountability are severely reduced if we're unable to hear or continually downplay their impact on their partners. Without opportunities for perpetrator accountability, we're basically saying that it's okay to keep using violence, and it is the victim survivor's responsibility to try and keep herself and her children safe. Elevating the survivor voices is a strong antidote to the silence. Because unlike other community populations, women who've experienced violence and abuse have been absent from activities and partnerships that acknowledge and value their experience. The voices, the perceptions, ideas, wants of women subjected to violence and abuse is frequently missing from decisions, policy design, around design of service provision. And it's, I guess, while that's, we are beginning to see that change, and was very pleased to see that Grace Tame, as sexual assault survivor, was named Tasmanian of the Year this year. And under frameworks such as co-design and community engagement, women who've experienced violence and abuse can be consulted as experts in the design of policy and services that affect them, and real mechanisms for meaningful consultation and engagement that acknowledges and values lived experience can make sure that services and responses are properly informed. The other amazing thing that happens when we elevate survivor voices is we start to extinguish the shame and the blame and the stigma that is unrightly attributed to women who have abusive partners or ex-partners. So I just wanted to go back, just at winding up what I'm saying, to the points that Yvette made. And I'd like to add that the barriers to help seeking, the silencing of family violence, is supported by the erasure of women from government policy. Alongside the experience of violence, budgets are not gender neutral. Impacts of gambling, experiences of mental health, alcohol and other drug, homelessness are all gendered experiences that need to be recognised and addressed as such. And alongside the experience of violence, the impacts of COVID are gendered, and so our recovery and forward thinking from here needs to be considered so that we have more equitable opportunities. We know from our work that the impacts of family violence are multifaceted and long-lasting. We also know that the majority of our clients in Tasmania experience a background of disadvantage, which may require multiple supports, and tailored interventions following the COVID crisis is crucial in helping victim survivors build resilience and return to full participation. So in the months to come, a reduction in household incomes across Australia will pose a significant and nuanced challenge to victim survivors. We're going to see reduced opportunities to leave relationships, an onset of new and controlling tactics within relationships, with the loss of jobs and pending rollback of Centrelink payments and other financial stresses. These things are bearing down on couples and families, and we anticipate an increased need to work with people presenting particularly on financial abuse, and how people can address risk and safety concerns with increasingly limited resources. And again, reinforcing, as Yvette said, and the last point that I'll make is that specialist organisations are also a really key component to this response. Specialist organisations must have enough provisions in place to offer service when help is sought. The importance of responding to victims of family violence in the help-seeking moment is well established by research, as is the fact that the absence of timely responses means that the help-seeking window may close for that individual or family, and sometimes that's closed permanently, and we lose our opportunity to intervene and keep families safe.